Hello, and welcome to Module 3 of the Pragmatic Works Introduction to SSAS class. Here in Module 3, we're going to share with you how to successfully set up your project so that you can have a successful deployment of your cube as we're creating this new structure inside of your analysis services instance. Once we have successfully deployed and processed the cube, we'll then go back and share with you how you can now start to browse your data. So we'll share with you guys how you can connect to your cube through Excel. We'll also share with you how you can do this through Management Studio and through an additional browser tab that you can find within inside of your cube back inside of SQL Server Data Tools. Once we're done with browsing our data, we'll then go back at a high level and go through and start exploring the different tabs that can be found within inside of your cube. We'll go through these and discuss these at a high level, and we'll come back and discuss these in more depth in future modules. When it comes to talking about processing your cube, before we can go through the processing and deployment phase of your cube, we need to go into the project properties and actually tell the project where we're trying to deploy our cube to. So there's two properties that we're looking for here. Those properties are going to be the target server and the target database. So the target server in your case is probably just going to be the local host, but if it's something different, you'll need to go in there and tell it. So that way you're not actually trying to create this new cube in, let's say, a test or in production environments. So make sure you have this deployed to a dev or a local instance. And we also need to go back in there and give it a meaningful database name. So during the deployment phase of our cube, it's actually going to create a new analysis services database back inside of our analysis services server. So by default, it's going to have the name from your analysis services multidimensional project set there within inside of your database name. So if you need to change that, you can do that here as well. Once we have successfully deployed our cube out to the server, we're then going to go through and share with you guys how you can browse your data from your cube. So as you can see here on this particular slide, this is a view that you'll find within inside of Management Studio and within inside of the cube itself. There's also an additional option here that was new to analysis services back inside of SQL Server 2012, is they now enabled us to actually connect to our data through Excel, and we don't have to worry about creating the connection string. All we have to do here is click on that button like you see in the image, and we'll be ready to start slicing and dicing our data right there inside of Excel. Alright, so that's enough with our slides. Let's go ahead and jump into our demos. So in this demos, we'll share with you guys how to set up your project for deployment and processing. We'll share with you how you can go back and browse your data, and then last but not least, we'll go through and we'll discuss all the different tabs there in the Cube Designer at a high level. Let's go ahead and open up SQL Server Data Tools. So I'm going to end our slideshow here, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open up SQL Server Data Tools. So we're back over here. We've opened up SQL Server Data Tools, but go ahead and look for this. Just point out over here my Solution Explorer is right now I currently do not have any solution or project open. So I'm just sharing this with you in case you are new to working with projects and solutions here inside of SQL Server Data Tools. So what we need to do here is we need to open up our completed module from Module 2, where we created that basic structure of a cube by walking through the Cube Wizard. And if you look over here on the left-hand side of my screen, you'll see there's a section there called Recent Projects. And right now, I currently just have one project in there. But if I click on that project there, which in our case is actually the solution name, so PW Training Videos is the name of our solution, you can see that when I click on that, it opens up that solution and all the projects within inside of that solution. So we only have that one analysis services multi-dimensional project there in the solution. It went ahead and opened up that project there for me. So now that we have our project open, we now need to go back and configure it for deployment. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to select my project name here called PW Intro SSAS. That's the name of my project. I am going to right click on that project. I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to select Properties. So I'm going to select the Properties option. I'm going to select the Deployment option over here on the left. And it's asking me for two things. It's asking me for where are we trying to deploy this cube to, and what should be the name of this new database it's going to create. So what you need to do there for your server is, again, make sure that you're pointing this to your local machine, dev environment, and make sure that you're not pointing this to production anywhere. And once you've done that, you need to go back and give it a database name. So by default, it's going to inherit the name of your project. So if you look back over here in my Solution Explorer, you can see that we gave it the name there, PW Intro SSAS, and that has essentially just carried over here into our deployment properties. So again, as we're going through this deployment phase, it's actually going to create a new analysis services database out there on our analysis services server. So again, if you need to change that name, you can do it here. But if you forget, again, you can always go back out to Management Studio and make the change there as well. So once you have those two pieces set up, we can then click OK, and we're now ready to deploy our cube out to the database or out to our analysis services server. Before we do that, there's two terms here that you need to become familiar with. So there's the term for deployment and the other term there for processing. So when we're talking about deployment, think of that as just the deployment of the structure of the cube. So we're taking the structure of our cube here inside of our Solution Explorer without the data, and we're taking that structure and we're deploying it out there to analysis services. You could also think of this as just as the metadata. So we're taking the metadata for our cube, and we're taking that and deploying that out to analysis services. That's for our term there called deployment. The other term for processing does the exact opposite. So the processing does not take and deploy any structural changes out there to the database or to our cube. The processing phase goes back out to our data warehouse, imports the data, it pre-aggregates that data, and then stores that there within inside of this new cube or this new analysis services database. So again, the deployment here is regards to taking the structure of the cube and deploying that out there to the server. And the processing phase is just the importing and the pre-aggregating of the data. So now we've talked about what the difference is between deployment and processing. Let's go ahead and deploy our project. So when it comes to deploying our project here inside of SQL Server Data Tools, it'll actually do a deploy and a process all in one step. So there's some additional property settings that you can go back there inside of the properties of your project where it only does a deployment without a process. You can go back and experiment with those on your own. We're going to go ahead and do a deploy and a process here for our project. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to right click on my project name being PW Intro SSAS. I'm going to right click on that project and I'm going to select deploy. And by doing this, again, you can see there in the bottom of my screen, it's doing a deploy and a processing of our data. So again, it's deployed the structure of the cube, and then right after the structure was deployed, it went through and started processing our cube and importing our data from our data warehouse. And you should see here on my screen that we got a deployment was completed successfully. So in my case, it worked fine, but probably for many of you, that process failed. So let's spend a couple minutes here of talking about why that process failed. So I'm going to come back over here inside my Solution Explorer, and the reason it probably failed was based on your impersonation mode that you initially created there and you set up on your data source. So I'm going to come back over here to my data sources option. I'm going to double click on there, and I'm going to come over here to my impersonation information. So as you can recall from yesterday's discussion there on Module 2 is that we had two specific options that you'll find most analysis services environments are set up for. We have either the Windows username or password option, and we have the other option there for the service account. So if you followed along with my examples yesterday in Module 2, where we're talking about using the service account, it probably means that whatever account is currently running your analysis services service does not have access to your AdventureWorks data warehouse data. So we need to go back and find out which account is running the service, and then we need to go back and make sure that we create an account, and that account actually has access to our data warehouse. The same thing applies here if you're using the Windows name or password. So you need to make sure whatever account that you put in here, whether it be your account or some other account, has access to the underlying data source. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel here because we're not going to make any changes. So what we're going to do here next is show you how to go back and find out which account is running your analysis services service. We're actually going to not do this here inside of SQL Server Data Tools. What we need to do here is we need to go open up the SQL Server Configuration Manager. So I'm going to come over here to my start page. All right, I'm going to come over here to my start page, and I'm going to start typing out SQL Server. And you'll see that here inside of Windows 8, I can select the SQL Server 2014 Configuration Manager. Obviously, this will be a little bit different if you're using Windows 7 or Windows XP. You just have to go to whatever flavor of SQL Server you're running, and then underneath that folder, you'll see a configuration folder, and usually this can be found there. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the SQL Server Configuration Manager, and what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for my account or my service here for this instance of my analysis services SQL Server. So you can see this is the service here. And this is the account that's currently running that service. So this account is using the NT service / MSOLAP SQL 2014. So that's the account that I need to go back inside of SQL Server and grant access to that account so that that account has access to my data warehouse. Now, if I wanted to, that's one option, or I could change this to a different account. So if I want to change this to a different account, I can right click on here and go to properties, and from here I can come up to the top and select a built-in account, or I can come down here and specify a different account and apply the passwords. Just keep in mind that when you do come in here into the properties for this account and you change it and you click OK, it'll actually have to restart that service. So just keep that in mind. So I'm not going to make any changes here. I'm going to click cancel. So we've identified which account is running our analysis services service. I now need to go back over into SQL Server and grant access for this account and make sure it has access to our data warehouse. So I'm now going to come up over here and I'm going to open up SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm going to open up SQL Server Management Studio. Again, you can find this underneath your SQL Server installation if you guys are using Windows 7 or Windows XP. So find whatever flavor of SQL Server you're running. If you look underneath that folder, you should see SQL Server Management Studio as an option. And this time I'm going to connect to my database engine. So I'm going to connect to my database engine here inside of SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to come over here to my security folder. And underneath my security folder, I need to come over here and look for my logins. And again, the login here I'm looking for is that account that was running my analysis services service, which in my case was this account right here. So it's ntservice/msolap SQL 2014. I'm going to double click on it, and I'm going to come over here to my user mapping. And all I have to do here is make sure that there's a little checkbox here next to my AdventureWorks data warehouse. And then down there, the bare minimum permissions I need here for this account is it needs to be a DB_data reader. So it needs to be able to read data from this particular data warehouse. And click on the checkbox and then click OK. Now, if you don't see this account there already, which a lot of you probably will not, you'll have to right click on logins, select a new login, provide that login name up here at the top, and then you'll come over here to your user mapping, find that database, and select your DB_data reader option, and that should fix it. And again, the same thing applies there for the Windows username and password. So if you're not using the service account to run your analysis services service, and for your impersonation mode you selected the username and password, all you have to do is go back into here, find the login for that username and password, and make sure that they have access and they have a data reader access to your data warehouse. Once you've gone through that process and you have set up the configuration and the impersonation successfully, you should then be able to come back over here inside of SQL Server Data Tools, right click on the project and select deploy, and it should deploy the changes out there successfully to your analysis services server. So once you see a successful deployment here, let's hop back over into analysis services, or I'm sorry, SQL Server Management Studio. Let's hop back over here into SQL Server Management Studio. This time, let's go look at our new analysis services database that got created for us during our deployment phase. So I'm going to come up here to the top. I'm going to select on Connect, and I'm going to select this second option here for analysis services. So I'm going to make that selection. You'll have to put in the server name and the instance name of wherever you decided to deploy your cube to. So going back there to our project properties, you need to use the same server here. Again, this should be some type of local dev or test environment. After that, I'm going to drill into my databases, and you'll see here is that new database that got created out here in my analysis services server when we were walking through the deployment phase of our project. If I drill into this database, you can see there's my data source, there's my data source view, there's my cube, and there are the dimensions that we created back there inside of SQL Server Data Tools. So now that we've deployed and processed our cube, let's show you how you can now go through the phase of actually browsing your data. So we're going to show you how to do this in 3 different locations. The first location is here inside of SQL Server Management Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to, underneath my cube folder, I'm going to right click on there and select the option here to browse my data. So I'm going to browse this cube data. And when we do that, we're going to have a new window that's going to pop open over here on my screen. I'm going to resize this real quick so you guys can see this a little bit easier. And we now have our measures up here at the top, and we have all of our dimensions associated with that cube here as well. So if you can recall from our discussions there in Module 2, we have measure groups and we have our measures. So in this case, our measure group name here is called Internet Sales. And all the measures associated with that measure group are these individual measures underneath it. So discount amount, sales amount, order quantity, all that good stuff there. So again, those are our measures and our measure groups. And then down here in this bottom section, you'll see all of our dimensions. So again, our dimensions here are just those descriptors of our measures. So the things that help describe those measures are found in our dimensions. So I can come down here, I can look underneath my customer dimension. You can see here's my customer key. I come over here for my due date, there's my due date key. Order date, product, promotion, sales story, and ship date. Those are all my different dimensions with my attributes where I can start to slice and dice my measures by. So the great thing here with starting to browse your data is that this is just a drag and drop interface. So I can come up here to the top and I can find my measures. I can find sales amount, I can drag that over. I can find my internet sales count, I can drag that over. And you can see how fast the results are being returned to me. So the results are coming back really fast. And that's because when our cube was going out there and processing the data, it was pre-aggregating the data at the same time. So that way it kind of already knows the answers to our questions that we're asking it. So that's why our responses of our queries are coming back so fast. So you can see that there are some things that we need to go back and clean up, such as like formatting. So if you notice our sales amounts and our order quantity, they're not set to be currency, or they don't have comma separators, or maybe they're not limited to just 2 decimal places. We'll go back in a future module and show you guys how to clean all that up. So again, these are just the measures, but now we want to start slicing and dicing our measures. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come over here and I'll find like my sales territory key. I'll drag that over, and you can now see again the results will change in a blink of an eye, but we're now breaking down those sales amounts and we're breaking down those internet sales counts by our different sales territories that we have within inside of our dimension. One other additional thing that you need to account for here is that notice that we don't have any other type of attributes in our dimensions. So right now in our dimensions over here, we're only bringing back the keys, which in our case was our surrogate keys. So again, these are our surrogate keys. We talked about those back in Module 2, but we're now only showing our surrogate keys here in our dimensions. And so this is kind of a limitation there of using the Cube Wizard. So as we walked through the Cube Wizard yesterday, it only selected our surrogate keys. So in our next module, or in our next couple modules, we'll go back and show you guys actually how to build out your dimensions to include all of the attributes that you need for all of your reporting needs. So again, just kind of sharing that information there with you. What we're going to do here next, again, we're inside of Management Studio. Let's hop back over here into side of SQL Server Data Tools and show you guys how you can do that same browsing technique, but instead of having to go back to Management Studio, you can do everything here inside of SQL Server Data Tools. So I'm going to hop back over here inside of my cube file. If you don't have your cube file opened up here as a tab, just come back over here to your Solution Explorer and double click on it and it'll open up. And if I look over here on the very far right, you'll see here is my browser tab. So if I click on my browser tab, I now have that same drag and drop interface that we had back there inside of Management Studio. So I can come back over here to my measure groups folder and look inside of internet sales, and I can drag over those same measures that we just got done looking at. And you can see I'm getting the same type of performance that we received back there inside of Management Studio. So I can come back down here and look underneath sales territory, drag over my sales territory key, and we're seeing the same exact numbers and we're seeing the same exact query performance that we saw before. So they're still coming back here lightning fast. So those are 2 options of browsing your data. But as you guys can see here, our formatting is still not taking into account, and it will never take into account here. So even if we were to go back and clean up our formatting, and we're coming over here to our browser tab, just keep in mind you will not actually see the format here inside of your browser tab, or even back inside of SQL Server Management Studio. So the next option I'm going to show you is something that you should always be doing to making sure that your data has been formatted correctly, and that you're validating and testing your data that way as well. And the last one we're going to do is here, we'll show you how to connect to Excel. So in past versions of analysis services, like back inside of SQL Server 2008 and 2005, you could still connect to your cube through Excel, but you'd have to go through and create that connection string on your own. When SQL Server 2012 was released, they now have added our little Excel add-in here, where we can click on this little Excel button towards the top of our ribbon here inside of our cube file. I can click on that Excel button, and what it's going to do is going to launch open Excel. Here I have Excel or Office 2013 installed. I'm going to enable this, And you can see I now have access to all of my fields over here in my pivot table fields list. So I can now start slicing and dicing my data here inside of Excel by just clicking on my fields I want to display there inside of my pivot table. So if I do the same thing, if I select my sales amounts and I select my internet sales counts, again, notice that we don't have any proper number formatting here inside of my pivot table. And if I want to slice and dice this again by sales territory key, I can click on this, and I'm seeing the same results that we saw back there inside of both SQL Server Data Tools and Management Studio. But 99% of the time, most of your users will be consuming your data here inside of Excel. So that's why you always want to come back over here into Excel as a developer and validate that numbers look correct from a formatting standpoint, so that way your end users don't come back and complain to you that the numbers aren't formatted and so forth. So again, you will not see any type of number formatting being applied there inside of SQL Server Data Tools in the Browser tab. So you have to go back and clean that up and then come back over here to Excel just to make sure that everything is looking correct for your users or your customers. All right, so that's how you browse your data. Let's hop back over here into Data Tools, and let's go back and just talk about our different tabs of our cube file, and then we'll wrap things up here for Module 3. So let's go over here and let's look at our first tab. So here's our Cube Structure tab. You can see on our Cube Structure tab, we have essentially another database diagram, but now it's showing us the list of our fact tables and our dimensions that are associated with this cube. So you can see here are my measure groups up here, which again is kind of translates to our fact tables. So in our case, we only have one fact table currently in our cube, and that's why we only have one measure group. It's called Internet Sales. I can drill into that measure group, and again, there's all my measures associated with that measure group. Down here at the bottom, you'll see here's a list of all of my dimensions that are associated with my cube currently. On our next tab over here, we have our Dimension Usage tab, and this tab is what helps relate our measure group tables to our dimensions. So again, this helps relate essentially our fact tables down to our dimension tables. And there's several different relationships that you can have between your tables. And we're going to cover this in more details in a future module. But just to kind of show you here at a high level, I can click and select one of these intersecting points between our measure groups and our dimensions. And it'll show me the type of relationship up here and the columns on how they're related. So in my case, we followed good kind of naming convention here, where the column names match between our fact table and our dimension table, which makes our lives as an analysis services developer a little bit easier, so we don't have to guess which columns match up to what. We just know because of our good naming convention. So that's our dimension usage tab, and again, that just tells the cube how our tables are related to each other. On our calculations tab, this is where we'll go and start actually writing our own MDX. So we'll be able to start going in here writing our own MDX, where we can do things like year-to-dates, or we can do parallel periods, or average, or profit. All of that good stuff can be done here through MDX Calculations tab. We can also go back and create sets as well. So we can create sets here, which we can use to help further filter and slice and dice our data. So again, on our Calculations tab, we'll create calculations, and we can also create them to create sets. We also have our KPIs tab. Again, the KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. This is where we'll have to go through and we can create essentially a traffic stoplight. So essentially visually telling us how well our business is performing. So if our business is performing good, we have a green light. If our business is performing average, we have a yellow light. And if it's below where we need to be, it'll display a red light there for us. So that's KPIs. We have our actions. And so actions will allow you to drill through to other reports. It'll also allow you to drill to maybe a different website. So if you have some type of intranet or internal intranet website that you need to launch and go to, you can do that here using actions. And you can also use actions to drill through into the underlying detailed data. So again, when we're looking at most of our data within inside of the cube, it's aggregated data, so data that's been rolled up. So if we need to go back and drill down and see the lower level detail data that makes up our aggregation, we can do that here using drill through actions. Some of these other tabs here towards the end are a little bit more administrative features. So we have our partitions tab, and our partitions tab is essentially a way for us to break up the data into multiple files. Very similar to how partitions work back inside a SQL Server. We also have our aggregations tab. And again, our aggregations tab here is applying additional aggregations to our cube to help return back our queries even faster than the initial aggregation of our data. So these are additional aggregations that we can add to our cube to make sure that these queries are coming back as fast as possible for our users and our customers. We have a perspectives tab here, and you can kind of think of a perspectives tab as like a view. So like a view back inside a SQL Server. So if you have a scenario where you have lots of dimensions inside of your cube and you have lots of different measure groups inside of your cube, you might have some particular users who maybe only need to see one fact table and maybe 2 dimensions, and they don't like having to sit there and scroll through that whole big long pivot table fields list looking for the information that they need for most of the reporting. So what you can do is you can create a perspective, which is a subset of fact tables or measure groups and a subset of dimensions to help with the user experience. So again, the common thing here to take out of this from a perspective point of view is that perspectives are not created for security, so just an ease of use tool. Translations is something that I don't find myself using very often because I'm not bilingual, but if you have scenarios where you need to create this cube and you need to have it support multiple different language, you can come over here and create translations as well. Just the one thing to keep in mind with this is that when you're creating translations is that you manually have to provide the translation. So if you come in here and you were to pick German or French or Spanish or whatever else it may be, it will allow you to do that, but then you have to provide the translation. So what does bikes translate over into Spanish? Well, you have to type that up. And then what does it translate into German? Well, you'd have to type that up and so forth. So not used very often. And then our last tab over here is our browser tab, which we've already shared with you. It says after your cube has been deployed and processed, you can then come over here and start slicing and dicing your data. So that wraps up module 3 here. And in our next module is module 4. And in module 4, we'll go through the process of actually building out your dimensions and your cubes a little bit further.